In a minute, we're going to see sort of 8 blocks of clips, and just a couple of things. From the first clips that you'll see here in the 1970s, things have changed considerably in the way that disabled people see themselves and the way that we want ourselves to be portrayed. But the question is whether that really has changed in the way that most people see us, and whether the mass media can and does play a role in that, I'm sure, is true, but how much and how it does that is another. At the UN, we've been successful in 2006 in getting a Universal Human Rights Treaty through, which sees a paradigm shift from seeing the problem in the person, what we can't do, to seeing the problem in society, the attitudes and barriers that get in our way. But too often, in creative output, we still go back to those older ideas which are around us everywhere in the literature, art and theatre, culture, stories, and it's all too tempting to go back to those rather than to try and consult with disabled people about how we would like to be portrayed. And so you'll see a mixture of different things here. But I think what's interesting, if we turn the focus onto sexuality and relationships, one of the persistent stereotypes of us, and many authors think there are about 10 stereotypes, so it's not just one of disability, is that we're asexual and incapable of adult relationships. And I think what we'll see tonight is the very opposite of that. So without more ado, if we can start with the first set of clips, older documentaries. Thank you very much. Okay, so that's our first set of clips, giving a period in the 1970s. How much do we think things have changed? I'll come to you first, Ruth, as a young person. Does that chime with you as a young person growing up in the noughties and now?
I think, for me personally, I was brought up in a family where my disability wasn't really an issue at all, other than when hospitals had to be part of our lives and things. Growing up, I guess I had an older sister, and she's able-bodied, and most of the things I learned about boys I learned from her. So I was very lucky in that sense that I had somebody to guide me. But really, I don't know where I would have gone because I always saw my friends as having very different relationships than I would have as a young person with a disability. I was always, I guess, the last to have a boyfriend, all that kind of stuff, first kisses, sex, all that kind of stuff. It always seemed a bit delayed for me, and I don't know whether that was partly me being a little bit guarded or the people around me. I'm not 100% as to where it was really.
What do you think, Nabil?
Well, I was kind of amused when I saw that there was this clip from 1972, because actually, around that time, there was a campaign called Sexual Problems for the Disabled, called SPOD. And people were starting to wake up to the fact that disabled people might like sex and have relationships. And they started thinking, it's not right, it's a denial of human rights.
Of course, yeah.
But disabled people shouldn't find some kind of sexual expression. And throughout the 70s, there was this growing campaign to bring sex into a disabled person's life. There were some people who were very nice brothel queens called Cynthia Payne, who operated down in Streatham, and she would actually offer discount to disabled people. So they could. And there was another woman who's a great friend of Cynthia, called Tuppy Owens, and she, round about the sort of early 80s, she ran a contact club for disabled people called Outsiders.
Still going, I think.
It's still going,
Really?
yeah.
Wow.
But what I thought was amusing was I'd been brought up in institutions. I was in a hospital until I was 9, from the age of 3 to 9. I was in a children's home from 9 to 16. And trying to find out anything about the birds and bees was like trying to get blood out of a stone. But I'd heard rumours that a man had something to do with making a woman pregnant. And I couldn't work out how that was. And I kept nagging the members of staff, and they didn't want to tell me, until eventually a local vicar came to tea. And I thought, well, one way to pressurise them to tell me is to ask him. So quickly they decided to tell me, but they gave me a very brief description of what it was. Basically, you know, the member of staff, who was a middle-aged lady, a spinster, and she said, now, you know how boys have willies? Yeah. And, well, girls don't. Well, because I'd never seen a naked girl before. And I was 18. No. I was about 11, I think. And so I'd never seen a naked girl before. And I said, so what have they got? They've got a hole. All right. And the boy puts his willy in the girl's hole, and she has a baby, and that's it. Right, off to bed. And that was that. And in 1972, where I was now 73, I was now 20, and the sexual problems of the disabled, I'd heard rumours of it, this campaign. I didn't really know that much about it. And I'd had a car accident, which basically meant that I had to go back to the children's home as an adult and stay there for a year until I got myself sorted. And of course I'm 20, and you've got these young members of staff working there. And at one point, one of the members of staff, for some strange reason, decided she wanted to seduce me. And she, you know, carried me up the stairs and plumped me on her bed and all that kind of stuff. I was actually crap, actually, I couldn't do it. But what was amusing was that the next day, I went in for coffee with the staff in the morning coffee session. And I was late coming in for their coffee. And this woman was sitting there. And one of the other members of staff, a senior, said to me, oh, Nabil, perhaps you could, you know, throw some light on it. What do you think of this thing about, you know, facilitating disabled people having sex? And I went, and I kind of tried not to look at the woman that I just slept with that night. And she was going, and I went, oh, sounds like quite a good idea, actually.
I'm going to cut you short there, because I think you could go on all night.
I know.
Anecdotes. Alison, how, when you first came to Channel 4, and you did some travel programmes before, I think, how was it? Were we there, or had we moved on a little bit from what we've seen here? 90s, wasn't it?
It was the 90s, yeah. I mean, I think disabled people were very much in programmes that were about their lives, or they were in specialist disability strands. I mean, I think what was interesting about those two clips for me was the first one felt very much like I was being told the story by the disabled people themselves. The second one felt like a documentary where we were peering in at their lives. And yet, that one, the first one was older, wasn't it? Which was interesting. But I think, because when I watched it, I thought we could learn a bit from this, actually, in terms of the frankness and how, in that little short clip, we got right into their lives. So, yeah, I mean, it was just a time when there were. I'm not saying that there were programs that were bad or there were stories that were really wrong, but there was not enough at Channel 4 of disabled people just having relationships like anyone else, shown in mainstream shows. So, yeah.
And it was interesting in that the first clip we saw, the interviewer was also disabled, so
Yes.
that was quite interesting.
That was quite. I thought, wow, when I saw that.
Yeah.
1972.
I won't bring the others in. I'll have to bring you in on the next clip,
Brilliant.
because we'll move on to the next one, which brings us a bit further up, looking at lifestyle and sex, and these are taking us forward to 1999, which is 4 years after the Disability Discrimination Act came in, and have things changed, really? So let's see the next lot. Certainly those clips would suggest the locus of power has shifted from the disabled people sort of asking for the crumbs from the non-disabled table to actually claiming their place there. But how generalised was that? And I'm not sure that today such programmes would be that acceptable. Perhaps though both of those programmes, I think, went out on a late night schedule. How well would they have been treated if they were on the mainstream, 9 o'clock slot? We would have had a very different uproar in the press, and whether, George Osborne in the current climate would be prepared to put money out to local authorities for disabled people to have subsidised sex. So quite a lot of issues there, really. So
Even though he gets it.
yeah, well, maybe. So, Ade, how does that strike you, the two first lots of clips we've seen, and are we making progress, and how do you see Channel 4's role now?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, my team is sort of building on the work that Alison did for all those hundreds of years. She was at Channel 4, sort of driving this agenda. so that's sort of where we are. But I think that for me, what strikes me about those clips is that sometimes it feels like we've moved on, and sometimes it feels like we haven't. So, we did a show, I mean, I can't take credit for it, it was a Channel 4 show, but as well, Alison was there, called The Sex Education Show. And one of the most memorable scenes in that is about disabled sex. And it's about people really enjoying sex, and and what's quite interesting from a Channel 4 point of view, not only is it sort of normalising it, but it also adds an extra creative dimension to our content, because it's an extra way of sort of looking at sex. So I think it has value for us in lots of ways, and it felt like it was giving an authentic voice to, sexuality of disabled people. So I think that's a good example, but I think there are other examples where we could probably be better, is that sort of my sense.
And Jack, from the point of view of a writer and working on some sort of hit shows like Shameless and Skins and so on, how difficult is it to bring in these sorts of disability storylines and relationships into those sort of successful shows?
You have to fight a bit, but actually, if you do fight a bit, then you find that you've got willing accomplices. On Skins, I really wanted to tell a story about a teenage carer, and I said to Brian, I think it's important if we're going. It was about her mother had MS, and I said I think it's important if we are going to tell this story that the mother should have MS. And as always with these sorts of things, there's limits to what you as a writer, where you as a writer can go. Do you know what I mean? Like, you do your research, you make sure you know everything, but then you learn from the performers. And you give space in order to be able to learn from the performers. And on that show in particular, on Skins in particular, I learned a shed load, and I think we did a better job as a result of it.
Okay. Well, we'll move on. Another particular group who maybe are even further down the pecking order are adults with learning difficulties and mental health issues. So let's have a look at how some of their issues are being portrayed. Thank you. So just one set of clips. We could have had many others. I mean, in the same period that was made, 1999, we'd had over 300 people first branches across England where the focus was on people with intellectual impairments or learning difficulties doing it for themselves, so living independently and so on. But it is an issue, right back to the Royal Commission in the 1890s, which was based on false science, said that a woman with learning difficulties having a child was 7 times more likely to be disabled, was based on a complete statistical lie. And this has built into the eugenicist movement, which had devastating effects for disabled people in Greater Europe in the Second World War, and is still having impacts on films like Don't Take My Baby, which we'll see later on, but where for adults with learning difficulties, it's almost de rigueur that their children are taken into care. And that's in Britain in 2015. So these ideas, which are false ideas, have a very long hand. So how do we think we can move this forward in terms of television? Because I'm not sure it's moved forward very much. There was, in fact, Alison, I seem to remember, an Australian show that you put on in your time, House Gang, which was a group of disabled people living together in the community, which was one way of showing that people could be quite ordinary out there. Are there other ways that we could do that, move that forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think House Gang was very revolutionary at the time, and I don't think it's really been the legacy of it has really been carried on. I think we see individual sort of dramas, and I remember there was a drama doc called Richard is My Boyfriend on Channel 4, which was in this territory. But I think what we need to do is get a sort of a character in a long-running show or in a mainstream show, whereas you kind of it's not the only storyline. It's part of the fabric of the characters.
Any comments, Nabil?
Well, obviously, because I'm old enough to have seen the development of trying to change perspectives, I've seen many things that have been done before 90s, like 83, The Skin Horse, which is about sex and disability. And there's also been a number of films. There was a film called The Eighth Day that was made in 97, I think it was. Fantastic film. But it had a cop-out ending at the end. So you had two genuine actors with learning difficulties, with Down syndrome, falling in love. It was a drama.
It's a French film.
Yeah. It was brilliant. But the director he bottled out because he couldn't allow them to live happily ever after. And he had the poor guy kill himself, through himself. And that is typical. There's always this cop-out,
They did it better in Antonia's Line.
Yes.
Wouldn't you say?
Yeah. But, that was in 97, I think, 96.
Yeah.
And, you had Walter, which came out in 1982, which, Ian McKellen was acting the part. And Walter and June was about a relationship between someone with mental health issues, played by Sarah Miles, and Walter, who had, learning difficulties. And so that was 1982, that was dealing with that subject. And I just think we keep making 2 steps forward and 1 step back, because we keep presenting to the public all these different kind of revolutionary ideas, and then we get kicked back, and we end up, rediscovering the wheel every decade.
And a good example of that is the Spanish film Y También, or Me Too, which actually stars an actor with Down syndrome in the lead part, who is actually Pablo Pineda, who's the only person I know of yet in Europe to get a master's degree and is a teacher. And he acts as part of a similar person trying to have a relationship with a non-disabled woman, and then it's a very interesting film.
I was in Walter, and I was working with a load of different people who were extras who had different disabilities, a whole range. And one of the scenes that I was doing was a guy with Down syndrome. And I was thinking, he's so charismatic. He's such a good performer. And I was thinking, why isn't he playing Walter and not Ian McKellen? And it annoyed me, which was the reason why, years later, I decided to write a play in which you had someone with Down syndrome. Because I was convinced, obviously, that people with Down syndrome they have a kind of reality to their performance, which most of us actors lack. And I thought that about this particular guy.
There was an episode of A Touch of Frost in 1997, I think, where there was a Timmy who had a love affair with another girl with Down syndrome, and actually back in the Raspberry Ripples we gave it an award because they were just there. They just had the relationship as part of a 2-hour drama series. But as you say, these are little blips on the horizon, and then it doesn't happen again for years. And I think, why do we think there is this resistance to actually just bringing the diversity of disabled people into the mainstream?
I guess I think going back to that idea of people with Down syndrome often being associated as children, I think there's a lot of fear, and they don't. I think a lot of it is fear. I think it's a whole fear situation myself. I think if we could get rid of that fear, and like you said, get more people on board, like we have allies, get get people with Down syndrome involved in it, helps tell the story properly, I think it'll help alleviate that bit, but I do think there's a massive amount of it still in there.
Well, we'll move on and now have a look at disability and factual entertainment and look at Unbreakable, which was one of Alison's programmes. Sorry, Undateable. Undateable. Unbreakable was something else. So can we have the next clips? Thank you. Well, it's run quite a few series, hasn't it? So, Alison, I'll start with you.
It must be good. It must be good.
Okay.
Run all that series.
What was the idea behind it to start with?
Do you know, it grew out of a documentary called Truly Madly Deeply, which was about the Stars in the Skies dating agency. And the commissioning editor for that wanted to build something on from that. And he and Betty developed the series. I should definitely let Addy speak about this because it's a Channel 4 show, but it's been, I think, a quite phenomenal success. I mean, I watched the first episode go out and watched the Twitter feed, and I just loved the way it went from people sort of a bit laughy at these people, and then they started rooting for them and saying, you know, don't take that chip, don't pick up the chip, Richard. And they were kind of right behind them, and they absolutely recognised the experience of the hideosity of a first date with somebody and getting it all wrong. So it felt like it started off as something that was about disability, but it had broken that, made it universal. And it's an absolute labour of love in terms of getting the casting right. It's an incredibly difficult show to cast because it's it's hard to find anyone who will allow cameras into that situation, and I think they've done an amazing job with it. Really, I can't. I know some people hate it, but I think more people love it. Really.
Addy?
From a Channel 4 point of view, we're incredibly proud of it. I think it's a show that's lovingly made. I think also what I love about it is that the universality of it. You start from a point of difference, but it actually ends up being a point of similarity because every one of us wants to find love, and I think that that's the big strength of it. So we can all relate to it, and I think that sort of moving on from that as well, we've got a show called First Dates, which is in a similar sort of territory. And I watched an episode last week, and there was a guy that had a disability, and he went on a date, and the person he had a date with never mentioned it, and it was just quite interesting. It was just the first date, and so I think that those things all help to push the experience of disability to the mainstream, and it becomes just one of the many things that you are, so I think that those shows do a great service, and also because they're so popular as well, so they're right at the heart of our schedule, and they're our most popular shows, so lots of people are learning about disability from these sorts of shows, and it helps to normalise it. So I love the Undateables.
Right. Well, let me put an alternative view from a friend of mine who's got brittle bones and is quite small. There was a person very similar. It wasn't her. And she recently wrote a blog about visiting the last freak show on Coney Island, where people pay money to look at people because they're different. And she said that that show makes her feel like that. And she's walking around the streets of Newham, and people shout out, white van man shouts out of the van at her, "Oh, did you get that date then?" And she feels very demeaned by the whole thing. So that's an alternate position. And I think the problem with this low-touch education, I agree it's entertaining and it gets good schedules, but does it actually change people's thinking about disability? That's the issue I would put out there, and I'd be interested in what other people think on the panel about that.
I'll let you take this one.
Well, I'm not really convinced that documentaries, I'm a drama person, and I'm not convinced that documentaries really change that many, attitudes as such.
Really?
No,
My
I'm not
name is
convinced.
John.
Sorry?
Didn't that change people's attitude
what, sorry?
about Tourette's?
Sorry?
My
That
name is
BBC doc.
No, sorry. But I don't think really that they change attitudes to the same degree as a drama, partly because I've been involved in documentaries for 35 years. And as I said, you know, there was this thing that I did in 2005. I did it as a joke. I saw this advert, The Odd Couple. I don't know if you saw it, but it was a series of documentaries in which they were obviously focusing on odd couples. And I happen to, you know, I have a girlfriend who's, you know, non-disabled, 3 times my height, etc., etc. And I said, do you fancy being on this, etc.? So we did it. I never watched it because I can't stand watching me anyway. But I don't think it really changed anybody's attitude. But if you made a drama of it, and people could actually identify with those 2 characters, and you made a story, then that is more effective.
The key thing is, though, Nabil,
Alison.
everyone has to watch. You know, if you make a brilliant drama and only 300,000 people watch it, nobody changes their mind. If you make a documentary that 5 million people watch, you will be, if you were in that documentary, you'll be walking down the street and people will say, I saw you last night, I saw you last night, and they will change their minds if that's the point of the show. Sometimes it's not.
Well, the reason you have small audiences, if you have small audiences for TV drama or film, is because it's not marketed properly. It's not distributed properly. And you know, what does BBC or Channel 4 do but stick it out at about 11 o'clock at night to ensure that people don't see it?
Well, no, let's talk about mainstream dramas that have included disabled actors. You know,
We're coming
2
on to that in the
episodes of
next section.
Doctor Who that got, you know, 4 or 5 million that had a deaf actor in.
Just recently.
Yeah, Sophie Stone.
So you can't. I mean, there isn't a rule that says if you put a disabled person in a drama, it's always going to go out late at night.
We haven't heard from 2 members of our panel on this Undateables. What's your view as a writer and as an actor on it?
You know, I don't watch it, so I can't really comment. I'm sorry, Alison. But you know, yeah.
Yeah, I'll come back.
I do find it quite heartwarming because I think it is, like you said before, Eddie, very lovingly made. I personally find it quite heartwarming. I personally wouldldn't feel comfortable being like purely because the thought of anyone watching me like on any of my first dates would be all my life hell on earth. But for me, I thought it was very lovingly made, and I personally feel that by having different disabilities out there and showing that they're actually out there looking for love, it's not something alien, it's something that's out there, something that's happening. And as well, just general improving people's understanding of what Asperger's is or what
I can see some
disabilities
people
is.
wanting to speak from the audience.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to resist that, but I'm going to
Okay.
do a straw poll of the audience. How many people think Undateables has improved people, the public's view of disabled people? If you can put your hand up if you think it has. And how many people think it hasn't? Well, about even there, I'm afraid. But obviously, I think people will have views about this, and when we finish going through the panel and the clips, we'll come back to it, if that's all right, okay? So now we're going to, people have been saying, Nabil made a strong plea there that drama is a better way of changing attitudes. It all depends if many people see it, of course, which is the point Alison was making. But we've got some dramas here to have a look at, and we're going to start with a rather shocking clip from a Dennis Potter play. In fact, all Dennis Potter's plays had some aspect of disability. He was disabled himself with a psoriasis and a major skin problem all through his life, but was also one of the new wave of writers, working class writers, writing for the new audience of mass television. And he did bring a lot of issues, but here he's going really over the top with brimstone and treacle in the first one, with someone playing the devil, raping someone who's a girl who's been brain injured by her father driving her over. So we'll start with that and then look at some more palatable clips. Okay, so quite a span of dramas there, and only a few of the many that there have been. Let's start with the Deptford graffiti. That seemed a very genuine scene there. How did you get that authenticity?
It's partly my experience. But the thing is that, Deptford Graffiti came about because I asked a writer if she would write a love story for me to star in. She'd already written a part for me in some children's drama that went out at Christmas. And whilst we were filming that, I said, "Do you fancy writing a love story for me?" Because quite frankly, I've been trying to write a love story for television and so on, and not got anywhere. So maybe I'm going to have to ask a non-disabled person. And since she'd already had a bit of cred and whatever, so she said, "Yeah, okay." So she spent some time with me talking about, different storylines, etc., etc. And I gave her bits of my autobiography. And the funny thing about it was that she put it on hold because the Bill had commissioned her to write an episode where they wanted me to be in it. And so she started to create this character, George, for the Bill. But the producers decided that this character was too big for the Bill. And so they just said, "Well, look, we can't do that, but maybe you could rewrite it." So Channel 4 stepped in and said, this is in 90, they said, "Okay, we'll give you some money, write a drama expanding on this particular story." And that's how it happened.
Okay, thanks. Jack, we saw two things I think you were involved in there.
Yeah.
When you're thinking about portraying disabled characters, and it was a plus for cast-offs to actually cast 6 disabled actors in those parts.
Yeah.
But how do you get to characterise those parts? And I think for people who hasn't seen it, it's not just the interactions on the island, but each character has their backstory illustrated as well.
Well, we did cast off slightly differently in that it was Alison's commission, and Alison who fought for it and gave us that opportunity. We didn't have much money.
It's an understatement.
Yeah.
Century, I think we could say.
We had, I think normal shows cost about 500 grand an hour. We had 100 grand an hour. And so it was trying to work out how we could tell the story as simply as possible, as well as trying to get the complexity right at the same time. We decided pretty early on that we wanted to cast it as we were writing it, and then let the casting decisions impact on the drama. We wanted the 6 best actors we could find to play these parts, and we went out and we tried to meet and work with as many disabled actors as we could, and then they helped shape their roles. And I think with writing, generally the thing that interests me at the moment, and the thing that I hope we're going to get into a situation of, is rather than saying I've written this part, it's for a person with CP who's got, do you know what I mean, like, one leg, and do you know what I mean, like, that you kind of, that there is a sort of, because we're starting to get into the role where when we colourblind casting, it's called, do you know what I mean, like, where you don't necessarily, well, yeah, but where all parts are up for grabs, rather than just kind of like your token parts. I did this other show called The Fades, which ended up, we did exactly that, and ended up with Genevieve Barr in one of the roles, and I hope that that's going to be, I think that's the way that the boundaries will eventually get broken down. It's not shows like Cast-Offs, but actually, the sort of more mainstream shows that are shown at the more mainstream times, where the likes of Nabil, can play, whoever on the show,
Now, Eddie, that was 3 of those, I think, were Channel 4 successes really over the years. How's the channel looking at sort of drama now with regard to making sure that the casting is across all areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of challenge for us, and I'm interested to hear what Nabil said about drama, because I think that our long-running soap is Hollyoaks, and we have had the disabled characters in there in the past, but we haven't currently got one. So that's one of the areas we're really trying to work on, because clearly the impact of having someone in a show like that that's on every night is quite a big impact, and sort of playing storylines where your disability isn't the heart of the storyline, you're just there acting. So I think that's a big thing that we really need to crack, and we're working really hard on it, because I think that if you're trying to find a character for Hollyoaks, they just need to be hot, like everyone else that's in Hollyoaks. That's sort of the criteria, so I think we're looking at that. I also think that generally, I mean, I was talking, it's a similar thing, but it's not the same. But I was talking to Stephen Moffat, who makes Doctor Who, and he was saying that unless he writes particularly that a character is going to be black or disabled, the default is that they become white and able-bodied. And that's sort of quite an interesting thing about how you become available for all roles. And I think that that's an area where we have to get better as an industry.
Bring Ruth in here. We saw you doing a very powerful portrayal there. What was your feeling about that production, and what is the spin-offs from it?
For me, it was a very long casting process, but it was very, very,
Sorry.
very... No, it wasn't you. No, it was very, very worth it. It was an absolute honour to be involved in, let alone to have one of the lead roles. It was absolutely fantastic. I think one of the things that I cherished so much on that was the fact that it wasn't clear cut. Yes, they definitely should keep the baby. No, they definitely shouldn't. It was left, and from the writer's perspective, directors, all that kind of thing. It was left at the end. People will make their own decision on whether or not they thought that was the right decision or the wrong decision. And I think to start that debate, start that conversation, I think that's what it did so well.
We're running out of time to allow the audience to speak, so I'm going to run the soap one now, and then there's a little input from me on that to broaden it out, and then we'll go straight onto the comedy and then come back to the panel, if that's all right. So we'll pick up soaps and comedy with my little bit in the middle, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Okay, so if we just run the next one, please. Thank you. Well, there we go. Okay. That's the end of our quick trip through television portrayal. We've got one surprise clip at the end, but now we can open it up. Any comments from the panel on both the soaps and comedy? And then I'll open it up to the audience in about 3 minutes. So anybody, things struck you from that? Obviously, the soaps are making an effort now. There is more going on, but it isn't, as Alison said, it's not there all the time in the diversity that it should be there. How can we improve that? Maybe Addy, we'll start with that.
How can we improve it? I think we have to keep pushing, and people like myself and Alison at the BBC, we just have to keep pushing for more representation across our major shows. And as we've said, the impact of things that are on every night is so important that I think those are the sort of places that we have to really, really target. So I just think we just have to keep pushing, and I think we have to keep talking to casting agents, and we just need to keep working. I mean, we're sort of trying to work out how we do it looking forward, and we're sort of trying to work out the places on the drama slate beyond the soap where the opportunities are, and starting from that point of view. But yeah, we've got to just keep pushing.
Amen. Yeah, and Alison, what you've got a target, I think, to quadruple portrayal across the BBC's channels in 2 years. How are you setting about that?
Yeah, the commissioning areas don't realise that I'm going to make them each quadruple there. This is not just across, I mean, that thing, that criticism that's levelled against the soaps, there's always only one character, is so depressing. And that's, I mean, every time I have a meeting with commissioning, I'm in the genre meetings with the different areas, programme areas across, I just have to keep banging on, really, until... Because, as Jack said earlier, it is just a question of just doing it. The people in power can just make it happen. Yeah. They don't need to sort of do focus groups. They just need to say, we want to see some disabled actors for parts in this drama, not for this part that we've written that is disabled, this one part, which means that only people with that disability are eligible for it, we have to just open it up.
Do you think, now we've got this debate the BBC's launched about what is the BBC and what's the future of the BBC, do you think we could raise some of these issues during that debate that's going on currently?
Yes, please.
Right, so you've all got something to do there, right into the BBC. Nabil, you were telling me before that you've written quite a lot of plays and drama and novels and so on, but what's the difficulty with getting the experience, first-hand experience of disabled people actually produced? What are the difficulties?
Well, I mean, the difficulties haven't changed in that producers still prefer non-disabled people in such roles. If we're talking about mainstream, a difficulty is commercialism. Difficulty is attracting big audiences. So, you know, I wrote a film script about the disabled Holocaust in Nazi Germany. Producer said it's a great script, but you need to have, you know, Hollywood stars playing those disabled characters. Now that was written back in '97, originally, the first draft. In 1984, I got commissioned by the BBC to write a love story for me to star in, called Telephone Dummies, and it got dropped. And I asked a friend of mine who was a writer and actor at the BBC, and I said, was it the politics? Because, you know, I'm a lefty, and there's a lot of left-wing politics in it. He says, no, it's not the politics. It's because you've got a scene of a disabled person in bed with a non-disabled woman. And he said, you know, it's too soon for them. That was 1984. And the big problem is that if we could have started then, you know, if the BBC had, you know, weren't such cowards at that time and went ahead and made it, we could have got a lot further by now. And then, of course, we got Depth of Graffiti and all that. And there are just so many attempts, you know. I've written a story which was a film script that was about a disabled bloke who's addicted to prostitutes, and he spends all his money every week trawling the streets of London. But he gets involved in a murder mystery, and you've got Jack the Ripper, wannabe, etc. That's a story which would have appeal to a mass audience because it's a thriller, it's a crime thriller, etc., etc. It just so happens that the person that's investigating it is a person in a wheelchair. And that is one of those things that is going to help change attitudes. And, you know, we've seen this constant back and forth going on, and we're not moving, really.
And just a quick word from Jack and Ruth. Do you think over this span, we started in '72, things have improved, and where do you see us going?
I think really what Age said earlier was in some ways it has, in some ways we seem to be stuck. And I think just the more pushing that's done, I think it'll happen eventually, just as long as we just keep going.
Thanks, Jack.
I think, yeah, what Nabil was saying, which is interesting, is, you know, there needs to be an actor, a disabled actor, that becomes a Denzel Washington. Do you know what I mean? Like, you know, and I don't know whether the system will support that. I don't know where that actor will come from, but that's the next stage where there's a genuine breakthrough sort of star where you go, it's not sort of like, you know, a niche story. It becomes a sort of detective story. You know, yeah, and maybe it's Nabil, maybe it's Ruth. Do you know what I mean? I'm waiting. Exactly.
In the house.
Exactly, but that's
So
what I
thanks.
for.
You'll all get a chance 1 minute to conclude your thinking, but I'm going to open it up now. We've got people with mics. Can I see where they are? Yeah. So I've stopped you in the middle there, guy with the longish hair in the middle of that row, fourth row. Yeah, that's you, yeah, the guy shaking his head around. You can have the mic first, as I stopped you earlier on. And can I see other people who might want to say something in this, please? All right, 1, 2, 3. Was there someone over here? 4. I've got those 4 there. Anyway, as the next ones. Yeah. No, the guy behind you first, and then you next.
Got
yeah.
Mike already.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, if you tell us who you are, it might be helpful.
And I don't mind being the next Denzel Washington.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome.
it's been, yeah, so this is going to be quite an emotional thing I'm going to say now because I've got personal experience with it. So it comes from the heart. First of all, the thing about popularity, just to address that point, I'm really against that because the last time I heard from various sources, if you go on the internet and you look up any of these horrific terrorist videos doing sickening things, they've got about 5 million hits or 10 million hits. Doesn't make them okay to make those videos. And under the premise of like, let's go with popularity, then the BBC should be making a few more of those because we could really make some money there. But obviously, that's not right. And further into that point, this is where my personal experience comes from. With people, I've had 3 lots of brain surgery myself. I've been quite unwell at times. I've been on various medications and suffered from all sorts of mental health things over the years since I was a child. Anyway, the point is that when I was ill for a few years back, I actually felt like I was in a safe haven of a brain injury organisation. I'm not going to mention the name for legal reasons. And I was approached by an organisation that wanted to make a documentary about people with head injuries. And I signed the form and I went along with it. Sadly, I don't remember doing that because I wasn't very well at the time. I didn't think I was not very well at the time. I think my mum probably would agree that I wasn't very well at the time. I then, a few years later, got asked by somebody what that was all about because they found it. I then had an absolute heart attack when I read the stuff that I'd apparently said. So I was well at that time, so I recovered. I was very fortunate to recover. Other people not so fortunate. I then phoned up the organisation and asked them to remove anything to do with me from that documentary. They obviously put up a fight, and I said I wasn't well at the time. I then threatened legal action, and they did. So my second point is I don't think it's ethical to make documentaries about people with mental... It's becoming a very trendy thing to do, to get people with brain injury and whatnot, just when they've just come out of hospital, to appear on this documentary. So I think you have to really be careful, guys. You're making like dating videos with people that aren't very well. They're not well enough to consent always.
Thank you. 2 points well made. I know you've probably got others there, but I'm going to stop you there, all right? Thanks. Can we have the person in front of you? Yeah, thanks.
A couple of things just to pick up on a key point you was making, and I'm particularly interested in your views around, pushing the boundaries, so to speak. And so I work in higher education, and I'm, particularly puzzled, around the place of disabled people within performing arts. And I recently finished an evaluation of a theatre company called Rieser, who attempted to work with individuals who described as having learning difficulties, and the insurmountable barriers that they experience to get people with the label learning difficulties through performing arts degree programs. And if we're talking about pushing those boundaries and where the next generation or the generation of performing arts, I just wondered what your views were in terms of how we push those boundaries and from your own experiences. And I know Nabil, say for example, in disability and theatre, back to the days of Grey Eye, attempting to support individuals through theatre, and I wondered where are we with that particular agenda?
We'll hold on to that one till the end and come back on it.
Yeah, we need to talk about access to work in relation to that.
Yeah. So keep your points. We'll take these 4 people who indicated now, and then the panel can come in. There was a woman in black here, and there's someone in the next row down in blue.
I think one of the things that I've worked in television, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, documentaries. I worked on Man Alive in the 1970s.
Right.
I think one of the things that hasn't come out this evening is the role of the producers, the documentary filmmakers in the process. Now, I think that The Undateables, for example, but there are many other examples. What hasn't come across is the manipulation in the nicest possible way that has to be involved in the production process in making it all happen. We all know as producers that it doesn't just happen by itself. You manipulate to an enormous extent so that the people who are, quotes, undateable magically get a date through an agency. Now, in real life, I don't think it's like that. And there is an enormous discrepancy between what is shown on television and the reality of disabled people's experiences. I've had MS for 45 years, and I know that when you try and date when you're disabled, it's an absolute amazing nightmare. And I think really there is a huge discrepancy between the reality, which I'm afraid is still very bad, and what is shown on television, which tries to put a sort of spin on it being better than it actually is.
Yeah. Thank you for that point. And there's a woman in the next row down in blue. If we can pass it to her. And those were the first four I saw, so we'll come back on those. If others have got points to make, think about them. We'll have one more round. Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I can't. That's why I'm asking. Two brief points.
Who are you? Thank you.
The first is, we used to run the Disability Film Festival here at the NFT, myself and Charla Kimyonchu. And it went from a 2-day event to a week-long event, gathering 3,500 people per week, each year. The amount of submissions we had from deaf and disabled filmmakers was enormous. So Charla still has a massive archive of independent film, excuse me, made by disabled filmmakers and deaf filmmakers. Some brilliant stuff in that archive. So my question would be to people who are looking for more diversity on television. Why aren't you reaching out for the indies, given there's so little money around commissioning? Why aren't you showing some of that stuff on television as well? And the other thing I want to flag up is I was part of a diversity committee for disability in the BBC way back in the mid-90s. It was called Spectrum. Yeah. And I remember then people like Chris Evans in education was talking about quotas and the importance of pushing that envelope and making sure we had deaf and disabled people included on education programs, included in drama and documentary. And then 5 years ago, I remember Kate Rowland talking to an equity meeting, talking about quotas then and saying, actually, I think it's important now that we start pushing for a certain percentage of people in every level of programming, every level of production management. And I still don't see that. So are you saying there shouldn't be a quota? Are you saying, actually, we're just going to mention it and the odd producer will put it through their scripts, the odd casting director will have that thinking? Because I don't think it's going to happen unless we're proactive.
Thanks, Julie. Thank you.
I'd like an answer.
Yeah, I'm coming back to the panel now. We've got questions on quotas. We've got questions on getting more realistic portrayal of disabled people's lives, getting away from the gloss to trying to get down into the reality. Let's start with those and any other points you want to react to. So we'll come along the line. Addy.
Okay, so can I say, I'll just take one question, but I'll take the last one, which is the one about quotas. We at Channel 4 last year launched our 360-degree diversity charter, which was a sort of big document which is about how we were going to move forward and increase diversity on and off screen in the industry. And the big strand of that is our commissioning diversity guidelines. I wouldn't call them quotas, I'd call them targets, but every programme we now commission has to do something on screen around diversity and off screen around diversity. And the off screen has got a target of 15% of the workforce to be from either a BAME or a disabled background. And we'll be publishing how we've done against those at some point in the future. So we are going down that route. And I think sometimes targets can be targets. We've tended to go to targets more than quotas, but I know what you mean. You do need things that change, that have a structural impact on how we do things. Otherwise, you end up having conversations like this forever, sort of thing.
Well, we have been
Yeah.
here again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I take your point.
Okay, so that's an answer. What about how did the BBC respond to that? I know you're new in post, only really 3 weeks working there.
Give me a chance. Yeah, I mean, the on-screen disability, I don't really see that as a, I think that should be a bare minimum quadrupling because we're starting from a very low base. But, I mean, it's worth mentioning Diamond, I suppose,
Yeah.
because all the broadcasters are going to be properly measured, both off-screen and on-screen,
Yeah.
by this big new monitoring system,
Mhm.
where the stats will start coming through next year.
Yes, that's right.
So everyone has got that in their mind, and I can tell you that the conversations I have now, even in the couple of months I've been at the BBC, it's on everybody's agenda, because they are being forced to do it. So, I don't. I know. I mean, I'm as bored with the conversations as you are.
It's worth bearing in mind that both Channel 4 and the BBC are public bodies, and they come under the Equalities Act, which isn't just complying. There's a duty to promote equality, and I think that's one of the reasons behind Diamond and other such things, to actually try and move things forward. On this end of the panel, what about making things real? How do we get more people in, and how do we make the portrayal and what's the programmes there more real to the lives of disabled people?
Speaking from my perspective as a writer, I think that there's a lot of fear around disability, which sometimes the disabled community don't help. The trouble is, when you make something, you're frequently shot down for it not being something else, and that's very tough. The truth is, it is a massive fight every time that you try and make something about the disabled experience, we've just got to try and enlist as many writers and producers as possible in that. I am worried about the change in government regulations and what that means, because it's going to make it more expensive to work with disabled talent. Grey Eye Theatre Company, who are a theatre company I'm involved with, we're just doing a play together. Jenny Seeley is saying quite openly she's not sure how she's going to keep the doors open.
This is on access to work.
Yeah, access to work is causing massive problems, and from
access to work pays disabled people additional needs of being employed, but there are now quotas and restrictions on it.
Imagine the conversations you're having with producers where you're going, I want to work with disabled talent on this, and they're agreeing to it, and then you say, and it's going to cost you more of your budget. Do you know what I mean? It becomes more difficult, and I think it's a disgrace the government's done it, but it presents a whole massive new problem for the artistic community in terms of breaking down that fear barrier, which is the most important thing to do.
When I first got involved with Channel 4 and BBC, certainly Channel 4 in the 90s, there was a requirement, if a programme was about disability, you needed a disability consultant to at least bounce the ideas off, and certainly... Right. I thought that was a good idea. Certainly some of the more eccentric ideas that producers had, we sort of shot down, and it became more realistic. I wondered if that's a way forward again. But I was coming down the line. So,
well, from my perspective as an actress, I think I'm very lucky that my agent will put me forward for any role that is of a certain age, female, white or whatever, black, it doesn't really make a difference. She will put me forward for anything if she feels that I could do that role.
She's not going to put you forward for a black person's role.
No, but
I don't see why not. The black person's playing Ironside, so why shouldn't
mixed,
she play
it doesn't, yeah. So she'll put me forward for anything that she feels that I could play, and then she comes up against barriers when they say no, that person won't fit because we've not got a disability in the story. So it is like a barrier there and a barrier there and a barrier there.
Right. Okay. Last word on this.
Well, I'm not quite sure what we mean by making it more real. Really, all we're asking for is that disabled characters reflect the world that other people experience. So, a lot of drama is about unreality. It's about absurd situations. It's about extreme situations. And another aspect of drama is, extreme characters and so on. And, TV and film is not really about the real world as such. But what has to happen is that when a disabled person watches a film or drama, TV drama, they need to say, that's me, in a way. They need to actually identify with the characters that are being presented and feel that that's who they are. And at the same time, non-disabled people need to be able to identify with a disabled character and say, hey, that's me. I've been in that situation, you know, etc., etc. Now, we don't get that.
I thought that the two of the drama excerpts we saw, every time you look at me and cast-offs, got beyond the gloss to what we call the internalised oppression, how disabled people have internalised how the majority world see us and then start taking it out on each other. And I think that's an important part of our lives, that we have to deal with that and get through that. And so I think the more and it's interesting that the producer of that was disabled and the two leading actors were disabled. And I think the more we bring not just actors in, but disabled producers and people, but also people who maybe have isolated themselves from the movement, they need to draw strength from a collective of disabled people. No one person has the answer. We need to set up advisory boards again, like we had on Spectrum back then 20 years ago, to actually say, no, this isn't going to work. You have to do it this way, because you know, it's an important aspect of life. It isn't just anybody dreaming up anything about how disability might be portrayed. It is about being real to our experience. And it seems to me we need to set that up again. Now, we're running out of time. Any last point that somebody wants to make? I'm going to take someone here we saw on one of our acts, and up there. Those are the last two then. Check shirt at the front and black dress, second row, third row down.
Do you want to take an extra 5 minutes?
If we can, I will. Yes. If I'm allowed an extra 5 minutes, so I can take a couple more. Yes.
Hi there, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you introduce yourself?
Okay. And I'm an actor, writer, and I'm just about to produce a couple of short films. So I'm trying to get as much of an experience, more sides of the spectrum as possible. But my main concern has been that with the current situation that the BBC is facing with funding, and with Channel 4 also being a public body, and with the current climate that is being directed against disabled people with hate crime on the increase, how do you feel is the best way to respond to that in a way? Because all your ideas have been very good, but a lot of it, to me, has come across as been like you're talking of it in an ideal world, and quite frankly, what we are in right now is not an ideal world. So I was curious if, by these statements, actually, they would show an alternative to what is being.
So, question there to match what we're saying to the conditions we find ourselves in. At the back there, yes.
Hi, my name. I'm a disabled actor, but my disability isn't obvious. It's not it's an invisible disability, I would say. And I just wanted to ask the panel, really, in terms of exposure and embedding disabled character, or rather disabled actors into mainstream programming, and roles being written for the character rather than for the disability. I wonder how important you feel it is that the disability is visible, because I've been for auditions and I've actually been given parts in which I've been told things. Very recently by a director, I was asked if I could beef up the blind, and I feel I'm not disabled enough to be eligible for disabled roles, but I'm also not. I'm too disabled for non-disabled roles, and I just wonder what the panel think about disabilities that aren't immediately obvious to the viewer, because obviously in terms of seeing people on TV and in mainstream programming, hopefully society will become more comfortable, but therefore does that conflict?
Right, we've got that. And the last person who's I've seen, because I've got this extension of time, but I want to give the panel time to come back, so you're going to be the last, sir.
I'm a disabled actor, and I'm 19 years old, so I've grown up in an era where disabilities become more acceptable, and we see a lot more about it on TV, and we read more about it. There's a lot more positive comments, and I've never been in a position where I've had to struggle to get a date, and that might just be the fact that I'm fortunate in that sense, or I'm outgoing or confident. I'm quite a confident guy, but shows like Undateables, there's a woman on the Undateables, Penny Clapcott, who has the exact same condition that I do. And I just feel with where we are nowadays with sex and disability and how much further we've come, and it's become more acceptable that it's not a big deal for someone with a disability to be sexually active. Do we need shows like that to flaunt that off? Because it should just be mandatory that someone with a disability is sexually active, and there might be people with. Well, I'm not going to say that's the word, but I mean, like,
mandatory.
it should not that word then, but like it shouldn't be any different. You know, it shouldn't. I just feel like it shouldn't be an add-on. You know, it's obvious.
Okay.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Right, and it's good that there are people who feel that confidence, like yourselves in your generation. So we're going to, if there's nobody else urging to get in, we're really coming to the end of our time. So 3 areas there that were brought up. What about people who are invisible, but how do we bring them in? Invisible impairments, there's a lot of them around. They do count under the Equalities Act as disabled, but how do you portray them? How do they get cast?
It's just to talk as someone with an invisible disability. That it's a thing that I've sort of struggled with as a writer. I think I've written, probably 20 parts for disabled characters on TV on various different shows. I've never written someone with an invisible disability, and I recognise that it's an issue, and I've never worked out how to do it because it requires so much explanation. And one of the problems in TV is you don't want too much explanation because you've got to explain enough of the plot anyway. But I hear you, and it'll roll around my head. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
I think some of the American programs I sort of deal with some of these issues better in a way that it was not clear that the guy in CSI had was a double amputee. It was only mentioned twice in 15 years, so that's pretty invisible.
Yeah. And
also R.J. Mitty
plays
up his cerebral palsy.
Yeah.
I mean, there is another example of an actor, Joseph Moore, who's
who's
deaf.
in Last Panthers, who's in my new telly show.
He started off, of course, in that big role where he played deaf, and he was, really made his name then. But he now plays any role, and I think it's about there has to be a fluidity for the talent and for the people casting the talent. So you don't have to get too hung up on whether the person's actually, whether it was an invisible. You have to just be right for the part.
Yeah.
Memento's a good film as well for another reference.
Okay, and any other last points that people want to come back to on what we just heard? Yes, Alison.
Can I say something about dating?
Yeah.
I'm sure Undateables will sort of run its course at some point. But I think you have to see it in the round. It's not the only show about dating. First Dates does include disabled people. In fact, the first series of First Dates didn't include disabled people. And I went and spoke to the exec producer and said, "Oi, why not?" And he said, "Yeah, but you've got Undateables." And I said, "No, that doesn't mean you shouldn't put some disabled people in First Dates." Oh, but it'll look like Undateables. But then, of course, when they did, it didn't, because the show is completely different. And so you just have to. Nobody should look at the screen and say that's the one depiction of rheumatoid arthritis or living your life as a wheelchair user. There should be loads of depictions, and we shouldn't sort of kind of load too much expectation onto one show or one.
We're as diverse and as ordinary as everybody else, and that's what needs to get across. There is, unfortunately, there's too much stereotyping around. We've got to have a disabled party, and we need to have more diversity in the range of impairment that's shown and the characterisation of those. And I think that's where we're moving. Did you want to?
I agree with. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Jack. I agree with what Jack said. Questioning is it still necessary? But I think portrayal of disability in mainstream television, very, very prevalent within everything that we watch. That is necessary. So whilst I think the conversation is there, and the more we keep having these conversations, the more things will change.
Okay. I think we've run out of time. I hope you're all sufficiently loved up from this discussion. But we're going to end on a light-hearted clip, courtesy of Channel 4. Thank you very much. So, if we can have the sound down a bit. So, I'd like to thank very much our panel for, I think, giving us an interesting set of discussions. And that last clip really tells us that, sexuality and love for disabled people is just a subset of the issues that we face, issues between men and women, men and men, and women, and that we have to tackle wider issues like patriarchy and feminism if we are actually going to move forward as disabled people. and that there isn't a bubble that is just disability. All these issues are cross-sectional, and we need to remember that as we go forward, hopefully, into a new age of seeing much more disability portrayal by disabled actors, producers, directors, and writers. And I think as part of that, we've got a day conference here, the UK Disability History Month. I think you've had a flyer about it on the 19th of November. Please come along if you want to spend more time discussing these issues there. There's a launch also in the evening. And we're talking to BFI about bringing back some sort of film festival. It will be not quite what you had before. We were suggesting a weekend, a Friday, Saturday and Sunday next year, both of films made by disabled filmmakers and actually critiquing mainstream attempts to do it. So we're going to try and do that next year if we can raise the funding. So we are going to try and bring it back on the agenda. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and particularly thank our panel. So thanks very much.